Okay, Chevra. We were in the middle of this long Biurin paragraph yesterday, and the question comes up about how to assess damage. Um, it's very difficult to know how you compensate someone for destroying their property. Do you have to give them replacement value? The strict way that the Gemara assesses damages is that you take the difference of what the object was worth before the damage, what it's now worth after the damage, and you pay the difference. That's what you have to pay. The difficulty becomes and this is really the question that Rav Stern is raising in this very long commentary, is that in the modern world, there are certain commodities that lose a huge amount, or the vast majority of their value, once it becomes a used item. And so the replacement value is much higher. I need that item, whether it's a garment or a window for my property or whatever it is, could be sundry other items that are damaged by another person. If we were to take just the value of the item before it was damaged, it would be a fraction of what I would need to in order to replace it with a new one of those things. And so that's really, and he puts it in terms of, let's say, a garment. I'm walking through an area that I'm allowed to be, and a fellow pours paint all over me, ruins my suit or my shirt or whatever it is. And he says, look, I might have only had the suit for a few days, but it was an Armani suit, and I paid $1,000 or $2,000 for it. And but once I wore it for a couple of days, its value is a fraction of what it was when I first took it off the rack. So does that mean that the guy only has to pay me $150 instead of the original $1,000 that it was worth? It doesn't seem to be fair. And so that was the question that he raised. So he says, Venira la'anius daiti. And it would seem to me, therefore, says Rav Stern, that nowadays people, the vast majority of people, do not buy used clothing. So he says that the way that we evaluate damages has to be different from the way that it was done in the times of Chazal, because of changed circumstances in the financial world. And therefore, the proper way of making evaluation of damage should be as follows. He says, let's say you're dealing with a certain kind of garment that the typical shelf life, not shelf life, but the life of how long you use a typical garment like this is 3 years. He's just giving an example.
The life expectancy, yeah?
The life expectancy of this garment is like 3 years. So then assume that you divide up the value of the garment based on its life expectancy. And to basically deduct, how long the guy has been using the garment versus a brand new item, a shirt that let's say the item is a shirt. He paid $50 for the shirt. Typically, a nice shirt has a life expectancy 3 years, 5 years, and then eventually, after multiple times that you launder it, it starts to become, it starts to fray. Okay, whether it's at the collar or whether it's at the sleeve. Okay, so he says, take whatever the life expectancy. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's 3 years on this shirt. Then see how long he's had it, and then deduct that life, that amount from its value. But he says, but you can't say that you deduct the third each year, because the first year is not the same as the second or third year. Because during the first year, the item is worth much more to the owner, and it is much of a newer quality in the first year than it is in the second and the third year. And I guess what he's suggesting is that, let's say, during the first year, it loses the least amount of its value. And in year two and in year three, it loses more of its value. So, for example, let's say the shirt was worth $50. So in the first year, you would say that it only loses $10 of its value. And then in each subsequent year, year two and year three, it loses $20 more of its value. So in the first year, it loses less of its value. And in the second and third year, it loses equal amounts.
Rabbi, I guess it's based on the utility it has to you, the value it has to you.
Right, the value it has to the individual. And it seems to me that if these earlier poskim who had a different method of valuation were alive today, they would agree. He says that we could suggest that actually that would be the real value to the rest of the world. It's just the only problem is that people today don't buy used clothing. And therefore, and that's the reason why the object depreciates so rapidly as soon as you take it out of its wrapper. But to the owner himself, and it's not just to that individual owner, but it's to any owner of a new shirt, the shirt is still worth a huge amount more than what it would fetch on the open market in a thrift shop, right? The difference, right? The difference being is that to the person who paid $50 for the shirt, it's still worth close to $50 within that first year. It's only as far as what would I get on the open market? I might only get $5 for it once I've worn it a couple of times. So therefore, since to every person, it's still a $50 shirt in his mind, certainly during that first year of wear, it's not going to lose a significant amount of its value. He says, I saw the Sefer Pitchei Choshen also say something very similar to this. He says, "Da'achar shehevri divrei nesivos hamishpat deleel kasav alav ezelashono, u'ledivrei hanesivos nira shehamazi chayfetz mishuma she'eno shavel l'mochro, aval adayin haya efshar liishtamesh bo." He says, he writes as follows. He says, according to the commentary, the medieval commentary, the Nesivos, if a person were to damage a used item which does not have a lot of value on the open market, but it still has plenty of use for its owner, the lo mikri bar damim. He says that it's problematic because basically the mazik will be able to get off easier because it doesn't have a significant value. The efshar lechalek the shiny benidon hanasivos hamishpa b'derech l'sadehu ha'ochel b'veis habliya she'ein metzias ba'olam sheyehi bar damim aval chayfetz haroi li'ishtamesh bo. He says, because in the illustrations of the Nesivos, we were talking about things where the damage that is caused is something that really doesn't have any value on the open market. But if an object still has plenty of use, hezeko oto Hashem sharoi l'chol ha'olam elashein b'nei adam kinyat hakonim chayfetz kazeh. He says, but if there's an object that the guy damages, even though it doesn't have a value to the open market, nonetheless, it still has utility. He says, in other words, everyone can still use it, even though no one's going to want to buy it. Bottom line is that what Rav Stern is doing is that he's quoting another contemporary posek who seems to agree with him. He says, if the object objectively still has utility to its owner, and it's only because of societal conventions that there's very little market for it on the open market, you still have to pay the damagee the loss of utility of that item. because for him, it's still worth a lot of, it still has a lot of use. And it's very difficult, therefore, to arrive at this kind of valuation, especially because he himself acknowledges that the newer the item is to the owner, the more of its value it retains, and it only initially slowly loses that initial value, and then more rapidly loses its value the longer he holds on to it. So it's not that you can break it down like by day or by week or by year, but there would have to be some way of trying to objectively try and find what would most people, how valuable would that item be to most people who owned it within the first year, within the second year, etc. V'ayin sham dehevi od b'shem ha'erach shai, etc., etc. And then he quotes from other sources. I'm going to skip to the fourth line over here. He says, Mikol makom zerak me'ikar hadin. He says, everything that I've written as far as creating a fair valuation is all going according to what we would call the letter of the law. Aval latzeis yedei shamayim nira dechayev l'shalim lo kama hu shava liba'alim. He says, but it would seem to me that putting aside everything that I've just written, what if you want to fulfill your heavenly obligation? I've damaged an object that belongs to a person, and I know that person places extreme personal value on that item. To him, it's extremely valuable. It may not objectively be as valuable as he thinks it is, but if it's, let's say, it's his favorite baseball card, and it's true that an old vintage baseball card has great value, but the reason why this particular baseball card has great value to this guy is because this was his favorite player, and he got it signed by that particular player. And it could be that it's in terrible condition, so that if he took it to a vintage baseball card shop, he might not get what he thinks it's worth. But for this particular guy, he's devastated that I've destroyed that card, because it represents for him his childhood. It represents, there's so much nostalgic value, sentimental value. And the reason why you would have to pay the guy what he thinks it's worth, at least to fulfill your heavenly obligation, within reason, obviously, is because it's true that there are many times that you can get yourself off the hook according to the letter of the law when causing someone damage, because there are many instances where there's something called grama, which is causative damage. Like, for example, you may have heard the case in the Gemara that if I put a poisonous piece of food in front of an animal that belongs to my friend, and the animal goes ahead and eats it, then I am technically putter from compensation, because I didn't force feed the animal. The animal chose to eat it. Now, that doesn't seem to be particularly fair, right? If I want to kill my friend's dog, and I put food in front of it that's poison, technically I can get off without having to pay anything, even if I'm clearly implicated in having put poison in front of the animal, because it's only a grama. I've only done a causative act, right? But he says the kaimel and the afshu pater b'dinei adam mikomakam chayiv b'dinei shamayim. He says in that kind of situation, you found a loophole to be able to get off in the eyes of Beis Din. But we still say over there that you have a heavenly obligation, that God is going to hold you accountable for having caused this guy a substantive loss. Vikan, and so over here we would say, I would apply the same argument. You poured the paint on the guy. Okay, let's say it was unintentional, but at the end of the day, he now has to go and replace this garment. He's only worn it a few times. He's going to have to go back to the store and replace it, right? And you could say to yourself, well, it's depreciated in value significantly from the time that he took it out of its package, because he's already worn it a couple of times. So yes, you can get yourself off on a technicality, but he's going to be out of pocket another $1,000. So your heavenly obligation is really to give him the replacement value. Ve'ein lahem shavius mechira b'shuk. He says, and there are plenty of situations, plenty of types of commodities where once you've taken them out of the package, they have no value whatsoever to sell them as used on the open marketplace. Can anyone think of examples like this beyond clothing? Certain electronics, perhaps. Computer, laptop computer might be another example that they lose probably more than half of their value once they're used once. But on the other hand, they're worth a tremendous amount to the owner. Here, he gives a very good example. He says, "Kagon mishkafayim liktsarei re'iyah." What about a pair of eyeglasses? Okay, I go ahead and I sit on your glasses. Okay, now the guy put his glasses down. He didn't put them down on a chair because then that's his negligence. But he was sitting down on a ledge, and he's put his glasses down right next to him. Or let's say I'm running, or I'm the guy at the stadium that goes woo, and then I knock off the guy's glasses and I totally shatter them. Okay, the adam shiyir tzalim kor mishkafav b'shuk. So I ask you, what's the open market value of a pair of personalized eyeglasses that it's specifically tailored to your prescription, to your eyesight? What's the open market value for a pair of glasses like that? Probably zero, because how are you going to? What are you going to do? You're going to put an ad in Kijiji, pair of eyeglasses. Here's the exact prescription. I got this. It's exactly this in this eye. It's exactly this in this eye. And then there's what's that term that they use for a certain
stigmatism.
Astigmatism, right? And I got this and I got that, and it's bifocals, trifocals, right? Everything is tailored to my exact needs. Lo yimtza avuram koneh. You're never going to find a buyer for that kind of personally tailored item. Or he says, v'chein shinayim totavot. He says, what about dentures, false teeth, right? I have a pair of dentures, right? Let's say, and the guy goes ahead and knocks the dentures out of my mouth as he's cheering for his team. And then someone steps on him and they're totally destroyed. You can't even get a penny for someone else's dentures. But you pay a fortune for a pair of dentures, right? So, but the original owner for these commodities are worth a fortune. He says, and therefore it makes sense to me, especially when we're dealing with commodities like this, which are tailor-made. And let's say, by the way, a custom-made suit would probably be in the same category like this. A lot of people get custom-made suits that are tailored to their personal measurements, right? You pour paint on mine, so that's even worse because, now I can't, I have to buy a new one, and this thing has had zero value or close to zero value on the open market. Even the thrift shop would have only given me, pennies on the dollar. Imlo medina al kolpana medin groma, let's say. So even if you could find a technical reason to get yourself off the hook, but at least from a heavenly standpoint, you should feel a halachic obligation to at least be yotze, so that when you get up to Shemaim after 120 years, they're going to hold it against you that you caused this guy significant financial loss because he was out of pocket because he had to buy a new pair of dentures or eyeglasses. Venerally, the gamim ninkot ledina es divrei haminchas pitim, and basically he says, therefore, use the system that I would advocate, which is, yes, there is a lifespan to eyeglasses or to a custom tailored suit, but take that into consideration. And if you're going to, let's say, deduct anything because he's been wearing that suit for 5 years, don't deduct, the bulk of the value, but deduct a certain amount of the value based on how much use of it he has left. But take into consideration the original cost of what he paid, and deduct the amount of time that that he's used it versus the amount of time that he has left, and work with the guy. Venerally, The gamim ninko ledinas divrei haminchas pitim shekasa b'simin shin pei vav the grama benazikin she'asa b'shogeg patur legamri afilu less sibei shamayim. It says there is an opinion in the Sefer Minchas Pitim that if you do a causative act completely by accident, then you're not obligated even from a heavenly standpoint. But mikol makom be'inyan zen niralinias daiti demin hayosher latzis al kopanim yedei. But it would seem to me that propriety demands that you try to fulfill your obligation in the way that I've described in order to fulfill what would be right in Hashem's eyes. He says, "Gam im asa b'shogeg," and even if the act was committed unintentionally, the hare adam muad la'olam, because after all we know that we're all klutzes. That's really what adam muad la'olam means. That we're all really, in a sense, just one step away from committing our next, act of damaging or harming someone else's property, because people are klutzy. He says,
I guess, Rabbi, we could say we're like a bull in a china shop, except we're worse than a bull.
That's right. We're worse than the bull in the china shop. The kan hare asa hahezek biyadayim, especially like, you caused the damage directly. And he says, I refer you to Tosfos in Bava Kama. That even if you do a causative act, where technically, according to the letter of the law, you're exempt, but you're still going to be liable when you do a causative act from a heavenly standpoint. And that's true, even if your intention was only to help the guy and not to harm him. I intended to help someone. I'll never forget the time. I still remember it because I feel guilty about it. When I had just first gotten married, and it was an icy morning in Baltimore, and a woman asked me to scrape the ice off her window, an older woman, or maybe I offered to help scrape off her ice. And for whatever reason, I think the scraper damaged her windshield. And I felt really bad about it afterwards, because I didn't know who she was and I couldn't even find her afterwards. But I felt bad. I felt that maybe I should have offered to compensate her for damaging her windshield, because I think I damaged it because of the scraper, because I was so aggressive. But, I wanted to help her, but at the same time, but anyway, so Tosfos says that to fulfill your heavenly obligation, you should, you should try to make good, even when you can get off of even when you can technically exempt yourself. Okay, so bottom line is that it's not so easy to know how to do evaluation on a used item. And most items that you damage are used items, right? In other words, so we would probably have to say that if it's something like, I break my friend's window because I was playing baseball and I hit the bat, or I was playing golf and I took a swing and it breaks my neighbor's window. So in that kind of situation, it would stand to reason that you have to pay for the replacement value of that window. This similar situation, I've had situations. I had two situations over the last couple of years where a neighbor crashed into one of my kids' cars that was parked on the street because they were pulling out of their driveway and they just weren't looking. And it happened twice with two different neighbors, really unusual. And in each time, the neighbor, without question, just paid for the repair. Now, one could argue that perhaps the door that they crashed into, or the fender that they crashed into, was already damaged, right? But that's not going to help. That's not going to mitigate the fact that they, it might have had a couple of dents in it already, but they have to replace the damage that they caused.
Rabbi, what happens if you have a piece of art and the value of the art is high, but the replacement value is low? I don't know if you ever heard the story of there was a piece of art in Florida where a guy duct taped a banana to a wall. And the value, somebody bought this thing for $120,000 US. And then somebody walked up to the banana, took it off the wall, and ate it. And so, so the issue is, does he pay, the dollar for the banana and the duct tape, or did he pay 120,000 for the replacement value of the banana for the, the art piece?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Especially the value of art is so subjective. There are certain commodities where the value is such a subjective value. You'd have to determine that. You see, the Rav Stern is not saying that if for this person it has particularly incredible value, but if another person had that same item, it would not be of that same particular value. What he's saying is that if you have an item that is customized to that one person, it doesn't have a value on the open market. But any other person who would have that same item tailored to their needs, it would have the same high value. In the case of the baseball card that I was referring to before, I don't think that he would require me even to be Yotzei B'dei Shamayim, just because for that particular individual it has sentimental value. I don't think that that's what he's saying. I think that it does have an objective value on the open market, and even though for you it has sentimental value, that's not something that you can take really into consideration, unless anyone else in that situation would have the same kind of sentimental attachment to it. But
so in this case, somebody else did. They paid 120,000.
Yeah, but let's say that guy who paid 120,000 was a Meshuggah, right? And would be very, very like
clearly.
Yeah, I'm saying so. In other words, let's say there wasn't a market for this. It's not that if it went to Sotheby's and it was bid on by a dozen different people, and it was eventually jacked up to 120, but the previous bid before it was 110. So then I think there's something to talk about. There is that art item has been sort of put on the open market, and there was more than one person who was willing to pay a high value for it. But if the item was never put onto the Sotheby's auction block to determine its value, and just one idiot goes ahead and says, I'll pay you 120 grand for it, then that guy really threw away his money. And then you'd have to look at what would people in the art world be willing to pay for such a thing, right? So I don't think that the cases are comparable. I don't think that the guy could demand to get 120,000 back, because maybe, first of all, why can't you put in a different banana? Just replace it with a different banana. It still looks the same. And he'd have to make an argument why that particular banana was so special, and it's probably very hard.
Besides
the
depreciation of the artwork would be quickly reduced.
Yeah, unless it was a shellacked banana or something like that. There's a lot of when it comes to creating valuations for art items, I think that's very difficult. You really would have to get it. Look, there are situations where artwork, there is valuation. People get their artwork valuated all the time. And there are ways of doing it. You go to an auction house and you have them do a valuation for you. And there are, pieces of artwork that we know for sure, and they're not unique. They could be lithographs or other paintings from the same artist, where they already have a track record of fetching a certain price on the open market, right? So there's countless examples like that where it is easier to determine the true value of something without going to the case of the banana. Okay. So I think we'll hold it here for today. And
it is very hard to follow Wayne's story, isn't it?
It's hard to follow Wayne's story. Yes, we have. have to think of other circumstances. But I like these examples of the eyeglasses and the dentures. There are many kinds of cases like that where something is tailored specifically for the individual, but it still has objective value, because anyone else in that similar situation would still assign value to it. Okay, we'll hold it. They have a good day.